So here's the deal, super friends. I really want to make some kind of comment that goes something along the lines of, it's gonna get hot in here, so take off all your socks. But I feel like that's just gotta be way too old at this point, right? Who cares? It's a cool jam. Hello, super friends, and welcome to another episode of Superhero Saturday, where we talk about the arts of superheroes, storytelling, and so much more. My name is Annie, and this little fuzzy tail right here is Cow. Hi, Cow. He's so cute. What a cute little cat. He is extra warm and fluffy right now because he grew in his fluffy winter coat. You're so cozy, yes you are. You're so cozy. Okay, you can go now. Anyway, today's video is actually pretty personal to me because we're going to talk about what it means to make a character with superpowers related to fire. And my next superhero that I'm hopefully going to finish writing a book for soon is about a character who has fire powers. And let me tell you, I did so much research about the rules about fire powers, and honestly, there are fire power characters out there that are varied as heck. Like, there are so many different versions of the rules. I didn't know where up and down was for a minute there. So to help anyone out there who might be in the process of designing their own characters with fire powers, whether villainous, heroic, or otherwise, or might be critiquing the work of someone else with a character that has fire powers, I'm going to talk you through my process for designing fire powers, or at least creating your own rules for fire powers, so that things can look a little bit more consistent in your story. Like with my previous design videos, this is going to be broken down into a few steps, and I've actually simplified it from 5 steps down to just 3 steps, although we'll be getting into a few little sub-steps and formulas in between there. Get your notepad out, turn up the heat, and get ready to follow along, super friends, because here we go. The first step in designing any kind of superpowers, whether that has to do with fire or something else, is to first consider what the power definition is and what its source is. Where did it come from and what does it mean to have these powers and use them? So before we even really move on from this, especially with this type of power, we've got to consider what you mean by fire powers. Although there are a lot of really cool looking and very powerful seeming characters out there with fire powers. It can be very hot, very flashy, very potentially dangerous, but at the end of the day, fire is just warm, luminescent air. So really, what are you gonna do with that? So let's go back to school a little bit and talk about this thing called the fire triangle. There are 3 things that you need to ignite a fire in the first place. You need some sort of heat, you need some sort of fuel, and you need oxygen, or an oxidizing agent, technically speaking. If any of those 3 are not present, then technically you just can't have a fire according to normal everyday physics. Once you figure out the conditions that combine to create the fire that your character produces, you'll want to consider how that character sources and synthesizes those elements to actually produce that fire. The first element of the fire triangle, oxygen, is pretty abundant. I mean, it's basically everywhere, so most of the time you don't have to worry about that. Although you might want to consider that as some kind of weakness for your character, which we'll talk about later on, because if they ever end up in a type of area where oxygen is less abundant, for example, underwater, then their fire triangle is going to become a fire L, which means they lose and their fire goes away. For heat, you have a wide variety of sources, but you'll want to consider each of them to see what's going to be kind of the most useful for your character. This could be a spark from a lighter, or a fire starter, or chemical reaction, or some kind of laser gun, even just exterior fire. Light a candle and you can get your character started. There's all sorts of things that produce heat that can provide that initial reaction to get the fire going. The thing that most people seem to overlook, and I think that this is a bummer because there's so much potential in this, is the actual fuel that's pushing the fire to burn bigger, brighter, and maybe be even more dangerous. You can use anything from common burnable items like organic material, plants, cloth, or even buildings to less common accelerants like gasoline, propane, oil, etc., to rare combustibles, including radioactivity. For these ones, you might need to do a little bit more research, and that's definitely not the route that I took with my character, so just because the science was just like really in depth. So either you can start digging down into radioactive powers, or you can just keep things vague. Pull an old Stan Lee, if you will. So when we're considering our first question about power sources, what type of fire do you want your character to use? Because there are different types. These actually create even little like sub-character tropes that you might want to consider or pull from or combine to make your own characters. The first is what I call the Grog Make Fire character, which is a character that can produce fire without even a lighter or anything to get them started. The second type is the Flamethrower character, and this is a character that weaponizes their fire into like beams of heat and flames that just shoot out and are usually theoretically pretty good for combat situations. Another type is what I call the Heater, or a character that has some kind of internal exothermic reaction that's bigger than the actual normal, and they can actually radiate heat from their bodies, and that's where they kind of get the ability to synthesize other things outside of their body into fire. So using the oxygen in the air and some kind of fuel source to provide that heat, complete that fire triangle, and get the flame going. This can be very cool because they don't actually need that initial spark to start their fire. They can actually weaponize the heat in their body as well as the fire that they might be able to control. Especially if, for example, they can't complete that fire triangle. For example, if they're working in an area like outer space where they don't have any oxygen to burn. The fourth type is what I'm calling, again, aging myself, but it's Da Bomb. This character usually utilizes like short-term blasts or explosions to kind of generate that fire, and in that sense it's not as much of a firepower character as it is an explosion type character, but it's really close enough, you know, just kind of wrap it in there. For this type of character, they might have some kind of special fuel that they like produce from the palms of their hands or something to create those kind of explosions. So if they want to create a bigger explosion or something, they have to store up that fuel or produce it, or have to practice and work on extending the duration of their powers in action. The next kind of subtrope is the radioactive character, and again, I am not really into that type of science that really takes apart what radioactivity means, but it does work very well in different types of stories, especially if you can find some of that science to build on, at least in some kind of vague sense, so that your character produces some kind of fire that is really much more potent and dangerous than just your ordinary kitchen fire. And the last type, to kind of wrap it all up, is just magic fire. So for example, if you want to just break all the rules and not worry about things, your character can just produce a fire that does not follow any of the basic rules of the fire triangle. Especially if you're using a character that has some kind of magical fire that might have some other properties that might not fit into the normal physics of everyday fire. And then just kind of treat it as like world-bending energy blasts of some kind that seems to look like fire. And for any of these, you'll also want to note if the character can control just the fire that they produce or the fire that exists outside of their bodies and outside of their production. Because if you can actually manipulate the fire that's already in existence, that's kind of a different power than just producing or controlling the fire. So take a careful think about each of those steps as well. Okay, now that we've got what type of fire we're using and kind of the rules about fire use out of the way, next we'll want to see how your character specifically gets their type of superpowers. And this kind of falls into the same kind of categories as we've seen many times before. They might be a mutant or born with some kind of special gift that enables them to control and produce fire. Another type is, of course, the classic science experimentation type of firepower, which is produced by, you know, some kind of chemical explosion, a reaction of some kind, where the character wasn't maybe initially born with the fire powers, but gains them through some kind of incident. This also tends to be mostly biochemical in nature, but it can be augmented with, you know, extra tools and stuff as well. Although you can go just to the straight augmentation route and your character builds some kind of special, new, unique way to create a flamethrower that works really well for some reason. Then of course you have the magic type character where the character gets some kind of power from an external source that's not really of this world, whether it's from different dimension, from some kind of magic powers, from alien type things, something from outer space, all kinds of things. You can go any route and just kind of like ascribe these powers to your character and give them some rules to follow that are specific to your universe. Whatever you pick, go with it and make sure you make it consistent throughout your range. Okay, so the first step was really the biggest one in this explanation. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to step 2 now, which is to talk about limitations of these powers. In this step, we're going to take a look at the highest heights of your power, the lowest lows, and kind of the biggest obstacles in between. For the highest heights, the biggest potentials that your character can use with this power, you're gonna wanna think through what your character can do at their most optimal power usage. How much fire can your character produce? How hot can it be? How specific can they target these flames? How much control do they have over them? How quickly can things burn? How far away from them can it burn? How explosively can they create some kind of explosion? Or how radioactively, if that's a word, do they produce fire like from their hands, like most typical fire users do? Or is it some kind of like mind thing where they can control the flames that are already in progress from a distance? These are things to consider when you're seeing how far of a reach your character can go. Then when you're done with that, you're gonna wanna look back at the drawbacks, the potential kryptonite that might take your characters down. For example, another big question that is often overlooked, does your character get hurt by the fire they produce? Hint, if they are not also inherently fire resistant in their wheelhouse of superpowers, then yeah, they probably might get burnt by something that's hotter than, say, 100 degrees. Does your character feel hot all the time, like they're in a sauna, or do they feel cold? This one's pretty interesting because if you consider that when a normal person has a fever, their internal temperature is really higher than normal, then maybe they feel like they have a fever all the time. And if they feel like they have a fever, they might feel like they have to bundle up because that's human nature for when your body is hotter than normal, is the extreme of the outer temperatures feels lower to them. Or you can go with the classic character that just is always running hot and they feel like a radiator to their friends. Next, you want to consider the real obstacles to using their powers, which we covered a lot of in actually the first step when we talked about defining fire and all the things that are required to have the fire come together and ignite and keep burning. Take away any of those elements in the fire triangle, and that's probably going to be some form of kryptonite for your fire-based character. Does this character need to refuel in some way? We talked a lot about having fuel to literally fuel the fire of their powers. So if your character is producing this fuel, possibly biologically, then what is required to keep that flame burning? Does it deplete their magical mana to use the fire? Do they need to eat a certain specific type of food to refuel? If your character only produces, say, 1 or 2 sides of the fire triangle organically, do they have some kind of tool that they use to complete that fire triangle and get the fire going? For example, do they carry around a lighter or maybe waterproof matches or a flint and steel? Depending on what type of fire your character produces, how does that fire look like in combat, and how might an opponent fight against them to either defend against the firepower or overcome it? Will just dousing them in water quench the blaze? Or is your character's fire based on a chemical reaction that burns hotter when water is added? Are they only stopped by certain fire extinguishing chemicals or maybe some kind of counter spell for magic? That's up to you to decide. Remember what I said earlier, fire is really just hot, flashy air. What real damage occurs in a fire is heat damage, or whatever is being burnt by the fire. So consider what effect this might have on the character, their opponent, and even the surroundings. And then what kind of effects might having these fire powers, how might it affect the characters and relationships of that character with other people and with themselves. If they're naturally warm and radiant, like I talked about earlier, pets like cats might really enjoy them and sitting on their laps because it's extra warm. Alternately, maybe it's really hard for people to get close to them because their skin is actually physically hot to the touch. Maybe their tragic backstory and how they got their powers kind of gets in the way, and the fire actually triggers some kind of traumatic memory for them. And maybe that is what flares them up. If they can't control their powers very well, then maybe they're very cautious about what they set on fire in fear that it might burn other things and burn out of control. And if they burn things accidentally, what effect might that have on the plot, on their relationships with other people? People with powers are still people after all, so when you build them as characters, you should also treat them as people. Okay, we're on the last step here, I promise. This is number 3, which I am calling insert creativity here. This is where you as the creator get to take some artistic liberties and take some ordinary fire-based powers and make them awesome. Here are a few ways you can do this. You can add in and layer on other powers. For example, one kind of cool combination is a character with powers of fire and ice. This kind of opposing characteristic that actually just in the end comes to temperature control. I'll actually probably have to make an ice video about this to get into the physics of that, because I am annoyed by a few things that get often overlooked by ice powers, but we'll worry about that in that video. You can add in that heat imperviousness to your character and see how that kind of affects how the character lives their life. Maybe they can jump into a volcano or do some lava bending, although it might be kind of hard to try and swim through like molten rock, so that might be something that you consider. And actually, an extension of that, the best way to do this is to think of creative uses of these powers. Just because your character is naturally warm doesn't mean that they're necessarily good in a fight. But if they can find some really cool ways to use it, they might find something really useful and novel and fun for the audience to see them put into practice. Maybe they can use their heat blasts or explosions to do some kind of like flying type thing or controlled falling. Maybe they can narrow down the flame and the heat in just one area and make like kind of a blowtorch type thing and weld things together. Find cool, unusual ways that they might use these powers, both in the heat of battle and in their semi-normal, ordinary lives. And lastly, just find some kind of creativity your own way. If you have some kind of cool inspiration and want to go with it, put that into your character, because I always love to see not just one thing, but one thing added onto another thing and mixed with another thing and turned into something new and different that no one's ever seen before. That's true creativity. And there you have it, my lengthy 3-step formula to creating a character with fire-based superpowers. I really hope this video was helpful in your creative journey. If it was, or if you enjoyed watching it, go ahead and give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more superhero content like this in the future. Make sure to also subscribe if you want to check out our latest community collaboration, which is on another video on my channel. Go ahead and click over to find out. And if you want to see my superheroes in action and get ready for the fire-based character who is, I promise, still coming in the next book, then go on over to our website at www.fearless9.com and check out the books for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, Super Friends, and we'll see you next time.